For our first speaker, it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Jones. He is a public health nutritionist. He's very interested in the role of agriculture and food systems on household food security, and I'm guessing now sovereignty is in the mix, as well as the nutritional status of women and children, primarily in developing countries, including India, Latin America, and East Africa, work there. He was trained at Cornell University. We have a large Cornell Mafia contingent here that we're very happy to attract. Yay! And he also, as he knows, I always am very fond of saying he was originally trained as a filmmaker and a geographer. So he really has the whole world view. So I think without further ado, the one last thing I wanted to say is my very, very, very favorite phrase from yesterday was el derecho de soñar. So entonces, en el apoyo del derecho de soñar. En.
All right. Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here to be able to speak to you today, and to learn from you all. What I'm going to talk about today is, as you can see here, is the potential and limitations of food sovereignty for improving human health. And I just want to acknowledge immediately that Professor Mark Wilson and Lily Fink Shapiro contributed significantly to the ideas in this presentation. So I'm new to the food sovereignty dialogue. I think that makes me exceptional in this audience. My research, as Dr. Peterson said, is primarily centered on how agriculture and food systems influence maternal and child nutrition in low-income countries. But I think my research definitely has intersections with the food sovereignty dialogue, and I hope that my relative beginner's perspective on these issues may offer some useful insights for us. So I'd like to sort of just run through a couple of the objectives. They're fairly clear and straightforward. First is, what are the conceptual linkages between food sovereignty and human health? What evidence is there supporting or refuting these linkages? And what are the implications for the food sovereignty research agenda of thinking about some of these linkages? And I'm particularly focused here on research. I'm not ignoring the advocacy and the movement part of this, but I'm, for this particular presentation, just thinking about some of the research implications, and particularly in low and middle income countries. So before examining what the linkages between food sovereignty and human health might be, one kind of has to first be clear about what food sovereignty is. And as I mentioned, I'm new to this, and I admit that for me it was a challenge to really pin down what is food sovereignty, what are some of the essential elements of food sovereignty. I found many definitions, many different ways of discussing it. And so for me, this was sort of my first challenge. This is sort of one of the definitions that I think is commonly cited from La Via Campesina. And you can see that the idea of health is right there front and center about people's access to healthy, culturally appropriate food. So I think health is very much a part of this idea. But I think much like the definition of food security that was adopted more than 20 years ago at the World Food Summit, this definition seems to be more about, more aligned with sort of as an advocacy tool rather than as a tool for guiding research. In large part because it's broad, and some of the concepts need to be sort of drilled down a little more to understand specifically what are we talking about with some of these ideas. As Dr. Whitman showed yesterday, there are these sort of 7 pillars of food sovereignty as another way of thinking about what are some of the essential elements. And much of the writing around food sovereignty has sort of applied these different concepts, these pillars, in the context of focusing on large-scale political and economic issues such as agrarian reform, trade agreements, land rights, and land grabs. So with that context, from the definitions and the different reading, it seems that there are sort of, what I'm seeing are sort of maybe 5 essential interrelated components here of food sovereignty. And from a research perspective, things that we might be able to measure. So here are the 5 that sort of, from my perspective, might be the most important. One is agency. the capacity of individuals to self-determination, as Dr. McMichaels mentioned yesterday, regarding resource management, production, consumption decisions. Agroecology seems to me to be very front and center of this concept as well, and using agroecological management practices from farm inputs to production. The use and valuation of traditional knowledge, and also the rejection of technology perhaps that maybe undermines traditional knowledge. Localization seems to be very important, shifting away from trade and aggregation to maybe an emphasis on small holders, local community resilience, and moving away from food as commodity only. And then also equity, equity and participation, sharing of benefits across social classes, races, and genders. So I think I'm almost certainly maybe missing some elements, and I'm probably not going to do justice to all of these, to be certain, because I'm new to this. But I think it's worthwhile to sort of kind of try to categorize some of these. And I think it's also important to note that these will vary depending on what context you're in. There's an interesting quote from Professor McMichael who says, "The strength of the global food sovereignty movement is precisely that it differs from place to place." So while we may be able to point out some common threads, they certainly will differ. But for purposes of research, measurement is important. And to have any hope of doing that well, one must at least have an idea of what you intend to measure. So I think to be clear about how we conceptualize food sovereignty is critical for understanding how it might or might not be important for health. So what are some of the mechanisms by which some of these components may actually affect human health? Well, I'm going to take a stab at that. Let's talk first about agroecological practices. There's lots of reasons why agroecological practices might be desirable beyond health. Because of resource use efficiency, pest regulation, stability, provision of ecosystem services. But what are their links to health? In terms of direct links, to the extent that agroecological practices imply organic, there's really little evidence out there that the nutritional quality of foods produced organically differs from foods produced through industrial agriculture. We don't see much evidence of that in terms of the micronutrient or macronutrient contents of foods differing very much. There is, however, more evidence that organic agriculture, foods from organic produce maybe have higher antioxidant concentrations, lower cadmium concentrations, which can be very important. We know cadmium is a major cause of vascular disorders, various common cancers, kidney disease. And also there's been shown that the lower incidence of pesticide residues in organic produce. So certainly important implications for health in those data. Another potential mechanism is to the extent that agroecology implies agrobiodiversity, there may be important influences on the diversity of diets. We know that diet diversity is hugely important for all kinds of things. A lot of great benefits arise from having diverse diets. This is one of my own research interests, and I've looked at data, secondary data with colleagues from Malawi, and also my research in Bolivia that looked at the sort of relations between crop diversity on farms and the diet diversity of households and individuals. We find strong, consistent relationships there. Even amongst farmers and families that are more market-oriented, we find relationships between the diversity of their farms and the diversity of diets and households. Others at Columbia have looked at this same relationship, and they found a relatively strong relationship between nutritional functional diversity, as they call it, and species richness on farms. That is, as the number of edible species increases, the extent to which the crops on the farm contribute to the nutritional adequacy of diets increases as well. But you can see there are outliers there. So farm A, for example, can have many species but a rather low functional diversity. Farm C on the other side of that. So there is a lot of variation there. But I think it's important to keep in mind the kind of species richness that we refer to, what might be most important for nutrition. My colleague Peter Birdie and I looked at the distribution of iron content of different potato varieties, and we found you might expect that looking at this variation, you might see a normal distribution where many varieties have low content, some have high, but the majority in the middle. But that's not what we see. We actually see more of a log normal distribution, where there are many more varieties that have a low content of iron, and those that are sort of in the right-hand side of the tail are very few. And this is really common for many different species. So this has implications for how we think about the implications of agrobiodiversity on for nutrition. Interspecies diversity may be much more important than intraspecies diversity. So I think it's important to consider that angle as well in thinking about these implications. Of course, there are other mechanisms. Another potential pathway between agroecological practices and health is the potential of not spraying pesticides. In developing countries, pesticides are often sprayed with minimal protective equipment, and this can lead to acute poisonings, adverse chronic effects like neurotoxicity, increased incidence of cancer, and there's lots of documented cases of this. On the other side, there's also the potential for different management practices to lead to enhanced exposure to infectious diseases, whether it be workers' contact with soil, wastewater, irrigation water, dirty tools, mosquito breeding areas that could lead to parasitic diseases like schistosomiasis, malaria, leishmaniasis, workers having ongoing close contact with through raising, sheltering, or slaughtering animals could lead to sort of exposure to zoonoses. And as many as about 50 of the 250 zoonoses are associated with occupations in agriculture. So there's a lot of, and I don't know which direction those may go depending on the practices, but that's another sort of potential mechanism here as well. Moving on to localization as another component of food sovereignty, how is it implicated in health? A great deal depends, I think, on how you define local and how you define localization. We think about fruits and vegetables that may be sourced locally. There's lots of potential for them to be maybe handled less frequently, less potential for damage and bruising if they're sourced locally, which could have an impact on nutrient loss. Maybe there's less processing if they're sourced locally. Maybe they're bred instead of for transportability, but for nutritional quality. Those kind of things may have an impact. Becoming more invested in and knowledgeable about where your food comes from could incentivize positive behavior changes. The other aspect of this, which has come out of the literature that I've been reading a lot, seems to be that moving beyond the idea of food as merely a commodity is another aspiration of localization, meaning that the local, through the local, there are efforts to revitalize community connections through food. And I think that's a very important aspect of all this. The direct health benefits of this are a little unclear, but we've learned, for example, that in societies where community is scarce, increasing companionship produces large increases in happiness, which maybe we can sort of think of that as sort of an indirect pathway as well for health, which isn't always considered. But eating local doesn't preclude making bad dietary choices. Overall composition of the diet may be more important than the nutrient composition of specific foods. And I think it's very important to recognize that in many poor rural regions and low-income countries, it's very difficult to have a highly diversified diet if you're subsisting solely on what is available hyper-locally. This is especially true in the Andes of South America, which is a region I know better than others, where there's a long history of regional trade between highland growers and those and farmers in the lowlands, or between fishers at Lake Titicaca. So there's a big importance on trade for diversifying diets, and so the idea of local maybe only be taken so far. Also, restricting families only to local could sort of limit their ability to access markets, which for many low-income producers are incredibly important for their livelihoods, for their sustainability of their livelihoods. So I think we need to consider sort of the potential negative impacts of localization as well, especially for poor, vulnerable farmers. Equity was one of the third components I talked about of food sovereignty. I feel like this is one of the ones we have the most strong evidence for in terms of how it may impact health. This has been examined largely in developing countries around the idea of gender equity. And we know that income controlled by women in households has a significantly greater positive effect on nutrition and health within households, both for mom and for children, than that controlled by men. Not just income, but also decision-making power as well. In many contexts, women's status improves with their empowerment, their control over resources and decisions. So does their health-seeking behavior, the feeding practices for children, treatment of illnesses, immunization, and also nutritional status. So this is a very sort of clear linkage between this sort of core element of food sovereignty and health. In terms of traditional knowledge, there are many examples in public health of successful applications of traditional knowledge to treat and prevent illness. The case of oral rehydration therapy is an excellent one, where it's been very difficult to reach many rural households with oral rehydration salts, especially back 20 years ago, and adapting home remedies to become more adequate was an excellent way to sort of save children's lives by using sort of traditional knowledge adapted and complementing what we know through science. So I think there's a lot of complementarity there between what we think about in traditional knowledge and through food sovereignty and examples in public health. But diarrhea is an example of a very kind of clear, conspicuous problem. Sometimes malnutrition can be much less conspicuous. And the case of child stunting, growth faltering, is one that often goes unseen. Children, for example, the little girl here you see on the photo, if everyone in her village looks like her, you're not going to think anything's particularly wrong with her, but actually she's growing not to her full potential, which has all kinds of long-term consequences for her health and development. So sometimes nutritional problems are inconspicuous, and traditional knowledge sometimes is not always poised to confront the problem if it's not readily apparent. So this is a question, so this is where sort of there's a balance between traditional knowledge and sort of scientific knowledge as well, which can be the same thing. There's also a question not just of what knowledge do we value, but what knowledge do we not value. And I think in my reading of some of the literature, it seems that there's a lot of controversy around the idea of transgenic seeds. It's clearly contentious. Currently, there's sort of the major commercialized GMO crops are they're relatively simple manipulations, but there's increasing emphasis on producing more climate-resilient crops through genetically modified technologies. And in terms of the sort of maybe the direct health implications of GMOs, there's sort of three principal health concerns: allergenicity, gene transfer, outcrossing, which I won't get into, but those are some of the sort of the principal ones we think about. And many scientific bodies, governments, health-related organizations have found there's really no greater risk posed to human health through consumption of these foods than those produced through traditional plant breeding. That's not to say there could not be indirect implications for health, and there's definitely sort of this balance between what might be the potential benefits of growing a transgenic crop for yield or for stability versus the cost that it incurs by having to purchase seed, purchase the inputs, and sort of being sort of bound to that relationship with the seed that you're purchasing. So I think there may be definitely some indirect benefits or indirect consequences of this as well for health. So I think it's something that we need to sort of think about on both sides. Finally, the idea of agency, which was the sort of the fifth thing that I mentioned. And for me, this was the most problematic for understanding potential health impacts. The question came to me is, whose agency is important? In which context, and who should decide whose agency is important? What does it mean to be able to define one's own food system? What does that actually mean? How do you figure out if you're defining your own food system or not? I think what it comes down to is the restrictions that are placed on producers or consumers to restrict their choices, either by institutions, by policies, by embedded sociocultural norms. This, to me, is sort of the idea of agency, is what are these restrictions on our ability to make choices? And I think the impact pathways to health are highly variable, depending on the specific restriction in question and the context you're speaking about. From my reading, naive as it might be, it seems that the food sovereignty literature really has primarily focused on restrictions associated with increasing globalization and its impacts on food systems. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with sort of globalization and some of the impacts it's had on food systems. These are some of the highlights, amongst others, particularly market liberalization, increased foreign direct investment, particularly in highly processed foods, global advertising and promotion, the emergence of global agribusiness and transnational corporations. So what are some of the health implications of these changes? Karina Hawks has done a lot of work on this, and some really excellent work, I think. And she finds there's no clear pattern emerging because there are obviously a lot of moving parts to globalization when we sort of think about that as a whole. There have been changes that have affected both unhealthy and healthy foods and ingredients. But one of the biggest points that comes out of her work, I think, that's really important to take away is that health is not just whether the ingredients produced by agriculture are healthy or not, but how they're substituted, transformed, and marketed relative to each other through the food value chain. And policies that intervene directly in agricultural production to promote healthy eating are not likely to be very effective or efficient if they don't take into account how foods are processed, distributed, and marketed, throughout that value chain. Because you can produce apples, but it could go into making sugar-added apple juice. And there's thousands of examples of foods that are produced that become not foods but ingredients in highly processed foods. So the idea of the value chain is incredibly important. And in thinking about the locus of where these elements of food sovereignty have focused, in my reading of it, a lot of it has been on that front end around inputs to production and around food production, and much less around what happens throughout that value chain. So I think it's very important to consider the entire value chain and thinking about what is food sovereignty really, what are the implications of it for health. This is kind of a summary of what I just discussed. I'll put this up at the end so you can take a look at it. So what are the implications of this for research? Again, I'm mentioning research in particular here. I think that it's important to avoid assumptions about the implications of food sovereignty for health. There's a long history thinking about production agriculture of agronomists and agriculturalists thinking that if we grow more food, we're going to have this great impact on food security. We're going to have this great impact on nutrition and health. And that has consistently not been true. We've consistently seen that you need to do something special. You need to actually accompany changes in production with behavior change efforts or with some other efforts to actually bolster the nutritional status of the food security of households. So growing more doesn't equal more nutrition. Being more food sovereign doesn't necessarily mean better nutrition. So I think some of these assumptions need to be sort of pieced apart and disaggregated to understand what are the mechanisms and what are the pathways and how do we understand some of these linkages. Nutrition and health have a multiplicity of determining factors. Food being one of them, a very important one that we need to focus on, but I think it's just one and we need to understand sort of the other determining factors as a part of that larger picture. From my reading, there's not a lot of empirical data either, and I think that is something that needs to be added to this dialogue to sort of complement the amazing work that's been going on around the theorizing around it and some of the work that's been going on around the empirical data that does exist. I think that's incredibly important for backing up some of these, backing up the movement. I think the other thing that comes out for me is that the systems and linkages here are very complex and context dependent. I think we need to move away from, if it even exists, the sort of a dichotomous understanding of a food sovereign system and an industrial food system. Because I think in many situations for many farming families, that is sort of a false dichotomy where they are applying practices and approaches that maybe have that are mixed between these different perspectives and domains. And there's a lot of gray area there along that continuum that we can focus on. And finally, I think for me what's most important is the idea of whose agency is central to all this. What do farmers want? In my experience in developing countries, many farmers don't want to be in agriculture anymore, especially youth. There's a huge problem in sub-Saharan Africa where more than half of the population is considered youthful or sort of under 30 years of age. A lot of them are leaving agriculture because there's no economic incentive for them to stay in agriculture. A lot of farmers that are in agriculture now, they want genetically modified seeds. They want to be more input dependent because of the opportunities it offers them for economic growth. They want to get into export agriculture because of a livelihood, because of that. And there are many farmers that don't want that. But I think the question becomes, at what point do we say whose agency is central to understanding this? And how do we sort of manage that and navigate that? And that's an open question that I don't have the answer to. But I think it's an important implication for how we understand what does it mean to have agency in all this. And just finally, in terms of a research agenda going forward, this kind of came up yesterday a little bit, thinking about research agenda. Again, I think from my perspective in public health, I think empirical research is needed to examine some of the linkages and also the mechanisms that may be linking food sovereignty with health, with nutrition, especially the idea of agency and traditional knowledge, which for me are really essential to this idea of food sovereignty, what make it unique. And I think it has a huge potential to transform our food systems in a really positive way. But to learn more about what does that mean in different contexts and how do we understand its potential implications. I think we need scholars from diverse disciplines, and I think we see that represented in this room. But I think more research needs to be reflected in sort of the diversity of disciplines that are involved in this discussion. I feel like there's a lot of research going on in separate niches, agroecology, and other areas that can be brought under the fold of food sovereignty and to really look at sort of what does it look like, what is the continuum of sort of a farmer's or a consumer's system look like, and how does that affect health? think there needs to be a greater emphasis on post-harvest value chain, as I mentioned. I think also we need to be thinking about consumers as much as the producers in this, especially urban populations. As the countrysides are becoming depleted and people are moving into urban areas, I think we need to understand sort of what is that, how do urban consumers fit into a food sovereignty framework, and sort of what is that linkage between the urban and the rural mean. And finally, I think, how does the food sovereignty dialogue reconcile the essential nature of markets, trade, and non-farm employment for the sustainability on the livelihoods of the poor? And when I say essential, I'm not saying in some kind of this is the way the world is, this is the way the world should be. I'm saying this is the way the world kind of is right now in terms of how our economies are structured, right? And farmers depend on markets for their produce. They depend on trade. They depend on non-farm employment, especially in rural economies, to bolster their livelihoods. So how do we think about these elements that are realities for farmers in low-income countries as being a part of this dialogue and not separate from it? And I think from my understanding of the discussion yesterday, these ideas are very much a part of this discussion. I think for me there are some questions about how do we amplify it or understand it in the context of some of these other elements that I brought out. So I hope that wasn't way off the mark in terms of my understanding of some of the elements of food sovereignty, but we're looking forward to the discussion afterwards and basically learning from all of you from how to think about some of these issues. So thank you very much.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, so please go ahead, Dr.
Yes.
Thank you, Andrew. That's very interesting, and I think you've added some new dimensions to this whole discussion. The one issue that I want to bring up is you mentioned the way the world is, and it seems to me that's an important point of departure, because when you ask questions about what the farmers want, what the consumers want, I think it's very important to talk about what do they want within the terms of the system as it is right now. So you did mention it's important for consumers to change their behavior vis-a-vis diets and nutrition, which I think is an important point. But why not take that idea and apply it to farmers and recognize that farmers these days are on their heels, essentially. They're not supported, as you mentioned. And so so when we're talking about what do farmers want, why are they leaving the land, we shouldn't be accepting that. We should be organizing politically to allow agriculture to be valued so that people can stay on the land and farming can be sustainable. So that's one point. The other point that's related is you mentioned lousy diets in some locales. So why localization? And again, I would argue that many farming communities have been marginalized over time, and so their locales are precisely deficient in various aspects of nutrition. So I think the point is that I'm trying to make is that I think we need to think about the immediate problem, but also the longer term problem. And the longer term problem is a political issue. So that I would try and combine the policies with the nutritional advice that you've given us.
Right. I would completely agree with you, and I think it is a point of departure, and I think that we can't accept, like, if the current reality we're met with is inadequate, we can't accept that. We need to sort of look for the solutions, right? And I think that the discussion yesterday around sort of the way that subsidies operate currently and what they value and who they do not value is an excellent sort of point to what you just mentioned. In no way did I mean to say that we should not be looking for ways to diversify what's available locally or to give farmers the tools that they need to thrive with their current resources, right? I think that's essential, and I think that the work has to happen alongside. But I also am cognizant of the fact that it's not something that changes immediately, and there's sort of this interim period where we need to confront how do we bridge where we are now to where we want to be and find some middle path. And I think a lot of farmers are doing that. They're trying to find middle path. They're trying to continue to farm the way they have farmed, but then they're going and working for 6 months of the year in the city, or trading labor on some neighbor's farm. They're finding sort of these hybrid ways of putting together a livelihood for themselves and their families. And I think we need to think about those elements as well. How do we support poor farmers to allow them to sort of make it to that step where we have changed the policy frameworks, which is sort of, I think, the essential work that has to be done. So I completely agree. Yes?
Yes, I appreciate your research here on health and sovereignty. One of the things I haven't heard much of last night or this morning is the relationship of agricultural practices or localization knowledge to poverty. And there is a very, very strong correlation between poverty and lousy health. And so I guess what I'm saying is more to what you're saying. We need to interrelate all these various things, particularly things like control of the value chain. And it isn't just production and consumption, it's also processing, transportation, storage. All of these things have to be considered also.
Right, right. I would agree, yeah. And if you look at the development economics literature, they talk a lot about how farmers who remain subsistence farmers are the ones today that are the most poor. And so there's this push to get them out of farming, right? We know that's sort of the narrative, right? And that's one perspective, but as Dr. Mike was saying, farmers are on their heels. There's a reason why farming is not working for them, and because of the ways they're not being supported and the ways that others are being supported. So I think there's a lot of, the structures that are in place sort of dictate that. But the reality now is that, a lot of farmers who are just subsistence are not doing that well. They are the poor, right? And they are the ones looking for other opportunities. So, no more time for questions?
Yep, I think we're out of time now. Save your question. We're going to have a whole hour